It's a question that haunts the earliest years of the United States.
13 colonies stood triumphant over the British Empire, yet behind their victory lay exhaustion, economic collapse, and deep political division.
Independence had been secured on the battlefield, but building a nation would prove an even greater struggle. What if the dream of a United States had splintered before it truly began, and the revolution had birthed 13 rival republics instead of one nation? When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, America's founders celebrated what seemed an impossible triumph.
A ragtag army had humbled one of the greatest powers on earth. Yet beneath the euphoria ran a current of unease.
The revolution had toppled tyranny, but it had not yet created order.
The Articles of Confederation, adopted during wartime in 1777, were a temporary glue holding the new republic together.
In truth, they created not a nation, but a loose alliance of jealous states, each clinging fiercely to its sovereignty. The Continental Congress, stripped of real authority, could neither raise taxes nor enforce laws. It depended entirely on voluntary state contributions, and few paid their share. Soldiers went unpaid, the treasury ran dry, and the young republic's credit collapsed. Commerce between states turned into economic warfare, as each imposed its own tariffs and trade rules. Inflation devoured savings, and debt crushed ordinary citizens. What the revolution had liberated, poor governance now threatened to destroy. By the mid-1780s, chaos loomed. On the frontier, British agents armed Native American tribes to resist American expansion. Spain, controlling the Mississippi River, closed its ports to U.S. trade. Foreign powers watched gleefully as the fledgling Union fractured from within. But the most immediate danger came not from abroad, but from within its own borders. In Massachusetts, the storm broke. Daniel Shays, a war veteran burdened by debt and taxes, rallied desperate farmers against a government that seemed no better than the one they had just overthrown. In 1786, armed rebels shut down courts and threatened to seize the federal arsenal in Springfield. The Continental Congress, powerless and penniless, could do nothing. Only a privately funded militia managed to suppress the uprising, but the psychological damage was enormous. If the federal government couldn't defend law and property, how long before the republic descended into anarchy? Men like Alexander Hamilton saw the writing on the wall. Without a strong central government, the nation was doomed to collapse. "We are fast verging toward anarchy," he warned, his voice echoing the fears of a generation that had fought for liberty only to risk losing it to disorder. In 1786, delegates met at Annapolis to discuss the crisis. The goal was to repair interstate trade and restore cooperation, but the meeting was a failure. Only 5 states attended. The rest simply ignored it. It became clear that polite debate would not save the republic. Drastic reform was the only path forward. So, in 1787, the nation's brightest minds gathered in Philadelphia to attempt the impossible, to rebuild the government from the ground up. The Constitutional Convention opened in a sweltering hall, shadowed by distrust and regional rivalry. Each delegate arrived with a different vision of America's future. James Madison's Virginia plan proposed a new, energetic federal government, one capable of taxing, enforcing laws, and maintaining an army. Representation would be based on population, giving larger states more influence. Madison envisioned a republic governed by reason and balance, not chaos and compromise. William Patterson's New Jersey plan pushed back, defending the equality of small states. It kept a single legislative chamber and preserved much of the old structure,
but granted Congress power to tax and regulate commerce.
It was evolution, not revolution, a modest patch for a failing system. Then came Alexander Hamilton's bold, controversial plan, a government modeled partly on Britain's constitutional monarchy. He proposed a lifetime executive, a Senate chosen by electors, and centralized authorities so strong that states would function merely as administrative regions. To Hamilton, stability was worth the risk of power.
To most delegates, it sounded like tyranny reborn.
Debate raged for weeks, factions clashed, tempers flared, and compromise seemed impossible. At the heart of it all lay a deeper moral wound: slavery. Southern delegates, dependent on enslaved labor, demanded that their property count toward representation, while Northerners balked. The bitter 3/5 compromise emerged, allowing a fraction of the enslaved population to be counted toward congressional seats, a moral scar that would haunt the Union forever. Through exhaustion, argument, and fragile consensus, a new framework finally emerged: the United States Constitution. It balanced ambition with caution, liberty with order, state rights with federal power. It was not perfect, but it was a miracle of human negotiation, a document that turned 13 squabbling states into one nation. Yet, it was a fragile miracle. Imagine if those delegates had failed, if pride, fear, and ideology had torn the convention apart. The states might have gone their separate ways. Foreign empires might have picked them off one by one, and the dream of a continental democracy might have died before it ever lived. History tells us they succeeded, but the truth is, they almost didn't. For a few tense years after independence, America hovered between rebirth and ruin. The Revolution had created freedom. The Constitution ensured its survival. And somewhere in that narrow space between chaos and creation, the United States was truly born. Picture the scene. It is 1791. The Revolution's embers have cooled, but the republic born from it is collapsing. The 13 states that once fought shoulder to shoulder against Britain now turn their backs on one another. The grand ideals of liberty and union hang by a thread.
Rebellion brews in the countryside.
Soldiers mutiny in the garrisons. Farmers march under black banners of debt and despair. The war had been won, but the peace, it seemed, was slipping away. The rebellion of 1791 erupted like a thunderclap, revealing how powerless the government truly was. Across the western frontier, British agents stirred up turmoil, arming native tribes to raid American settlements and disrupt trade routes along the Ohio Valley. The economy was in shambles. The once proud Continental Army, the same force that had defeated the might of Britain, was dissolving before Congress's eyes. Soldiers went unpaid for months, their boots worn through, their patience spent. Some deserted, others mutinied, and still others joined the uprising. The Continental Congress, trapped under the hollow shell of the Articles of Confederation, could do nothing. It had no power to tax, no authority to raise an army, no means to hold the Union together. The nation stood leaderless, and for many, the dream of a united America seemed over. Amidst this turmoil, two figures, Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, began to whisper the same name: George Washington. The retired general, now living in quiet dignity at Mount Vernon, was the one man all factions still revered. Hamilton and Adams believed that only his authority could heal the rift tearing the republic apart. They wrote to him, pleading that he once again take up the mantle of leadership before the country tore itself to pieces. Washington resisted. He was tired, his body aged by war and politics. But reports of mutiny, rebellion, and foreign meddling broke through his silence. The republic he had bled for was dying, not from invasion, but from weakness. "Without order," he wrote privately, "liberty itself is lost." In letters that would later become famous, Hamilton compared the moment to the final days of the Roman Republic, when men of ambition and chaos threatened to consume everything. Washington, he argued, must become a modern Sulla, not to enslave his nation, but to rescue it from its own undoing. By the spring of 1792, the old soldier made his decision. Reluctantly, solemnly, he mounted his horse once more and took command of what remained of the army. His campaign against the rebels was swift and merciless. Within months, the rebellion was crushed. But the victory on the battlefield only highlighted the deeper sickness within the government. The Articles of Confederation had failed. Their weakness had nearly destroyed the country. In the aftermath, Washington returned not to retirement, but to the center of a nation desperate for salvation. To many Americans, he now stood as something more than mortal, the embodiment of the Republic itself. His name was spoken in churches, toasted in taverns, invoked in newspapers as the Redeemer of the Revolution. He had led them through war and now through rebellion. People began to ask the question that would define the next chapter of history. If liberty could not survive without order, perhaps the nation needed something stronger, someone stronger. Hamilton saw his moment. Together with Adams and a growing number of disillusioned leaders, he called for a new constitutional convention to be held in New York City. The purpose was not reform, but resurrection, to replace the dead articles with something enduring. By midsummer of 1792, the city filled with delegates, veterans, intellectuals, and merchants, all united by desperation. Hamilton dominated the proceedings. His voice, once dismissed as too extreme, now carried the weight of inevitability. The old 1787 plan that had been mocked as monarchist fantasy, with its powerful executive, lifetime Senate, and centralized authority, suddenly made sense. Chaos had made converts of his critics. "Liberty without structure," Hamilton declared, "is a house built upon sand." He proposed something bold, even revolutionary in its own right. The New York Constitution of 1792 would create a bicameral legislature, an assembly elected by the people for short terms, and a Senate appointed by electors for life. But the true cornerstone of his vision was the Archon, a supreme executive inspired by the ancient Athenian magistrates. This was no king, Hamilton insisted, but a civic guardian, a single leader chosen for life, bound by oath to protect the Republic. The Archon would command the army, appoint judges, oversee foreign affairs, and possess an absolute veto over legislation. The title itself, drawn from Athens' cradle of democracy, gave the plan a veneer of republican respectability. It is not monarchy, Hamilton argued, but stability wearing the robes of liberty. Behind the scenes, Hamilton's allies, particularly Robert Crook, a fiery orator, began circulating petitions naming George Washington as the only man worthy of this new office. Pamphlets flooded the streets. "He saved the revolution. Let him save the republic." Newspapers printed poems calling him the Cincinnatus of a new Rome. Within weeks, a movement that began as political theory became a national demand. Even skeptics like James Madison realized the tide could not be stopped. His carefully balanced Virginia plan was set aside. Pragmatism won over principle. "Better one firm hand than 13 feeble ones," a delegate from Pennsylvania declared. On September 17, 1792, the delegates ratified the new Constitution.
3 weeks later, on October 10th, New York erupted in celebration as Washington was inaugurated as Archon of the American Republic.
Wearing a wreath of laurel, symbol of ancient virtue, he swore his oath before thousands.
Cannons roared across the harbor.
Bells rang from every church.
To the crowd, he was not a king, but something holier, a guardian sent by Providence to rescue liberty itself.
Washington's first act as Archon was decisive and controversial: the abolition of political parties.
He declared that factions had nearly torn the nation apart under the Articles, poisoning public life and turning citizens into enemies.
Parties, he proclaimed, are the cancers of democracy. Under his decree, all organized parties were banned.
In their place, temporary political compacts could form to debate specific issues, but permanent factions were outlawed.
Dissenters faced fines, imprisonment, or exile. The ruling shocked elites, but thrilled the masses, weary of chaos. For the first time in years, the streets of Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston were calm.
The economy revived, crime plummeted. The Archon's Iron Order brought peace, a peace that many believed worth the price of freedom.
On the global stage, Washington and Hamilton pursued diplomacy with ruthless pragmatism.
The Jay Treaty of 1794, signed with Britain, forced London to withdraw from Western forts, reopened trade routes, and restored American access to global markets.
Though Southern planters raged that Britain had not returned enslaved people freed during the war, Washington accepted compensation instead, a cold, strategic victory for the Treasury. Next came the Pinckney Treaty of 1795, which pried open the Mississippi River and New Orleans for American traders.
These twin triumphs transformed the Republic into a commercial powerhouse, expanding its influence across the Atlantic and into the frontier.
At home, Hamilton's financial architecture reached its zenith. The first Bank of the United States, founded in 1791, but now directly controlled by the executive, stabilized the currency and financed a wave of infrastructure projects, roads, canals, and forts stretching toward the Mississippi.
Under Washington's steady command, the Republic began to hum with prosperity.
Farmers moved west, merchants thrived, and for a time, the people forgot the fragility of their freedom. By the close of the decade, Archon Washington had remade America into something both familiar and alien, a republic in name, but an empire in spirit. The flag still bore 13 stars, but beneath it lay a new order. Disciplined, wealthy, and united under one man's will. Washington, ever the reluctant ruler, ruled with restraint. He forbade the trappings of monarchy, refused palaces, and walked among the people as citizen Archon, yet even he understood the paradox of his power.
Liberty had survived only because it had bent.
He would later write in his private journal, "If this union endures, let them remember not the man who ruled it, but the moment it was saved." The United States had escaped its own destruction, not through the triumph of democracy, but through the virtue of one extraordinary man. And as the laurel crown glinted beneath the American sun, the world wondered whether this was the rebirth of a republic or the dawn of a new empire. By the closing years of the 18th century, Washington's America stood tall, disciplined, and wealthy. The grand experiment in Republican rule had survived rebellion, financial collapse, and political disunion. Yet even as the Archon's steady hand restored order, the storm clouds of another conflict gathered on the horizon. Across the Atlantic, France, once America's ally, had fallen into madness. Its revolution devoured kings and commoners alike, birthing chaos that spilled into the seas. French privateers prowled the Atlantic, preying on American ships and plundering trade routes. The Quasi-War of 1798 would not only define Washington's final years, it would forge the destiny of an American empire. When the first reports arrived of French raids on American vessels, Washington did not hesitate. The Archon's oath was not merely to preserve the Republic, but to defend its honor. Congress, paralyzed as ever, debated endlessly. Washington simply acted. Under his direction, the Archon's army swelled in size. Funded by Hamilton's financial reforms and new tariffs on European goods, the nation's armed forces became the Archon's personal blade. The military that had once begged for supplies during the Revolution now thrived, humming with discipline and purpose. The officers were all veterans of the War for Independence, men who revered Washington as a living symbol of victory and virtue. They answered not to Congress, nor to the states, but to him alone. Political opponents whispered that the army was becoming a Roman legion, bound to its general rather than the state. Yet few dared to object aloud. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy, reborn from the ashes of neglect, took to the seas with unshakable pride. The new frigates, Liberty, Union, Providence, struck fear into French captains who once thought America easy prey. In sharp, decisive engagements across the Caribbean, American warships shattered privateers and reasserted control over the trade routes that fed the Republic's prosperity. At home, Washington turned his gaze westward. British agents along the Canadian border continued arming native tribes to harass settlers in the Ohio Valley. To Washington, a former surveyor who had mapped the frontier's promise with his own hands, this could not stand. The Archon ordered a full campaign into the Western territories. American soldiers swept through native strongholds, crushing resistance with ruthless efficiency. The Mississippi, opened by the Pinckney Treaty, became a golden artery of commerce, while forts and towns rose in its shadow. The Republic expanded, but so did the Archon's legend. The newspapers called him the Father of the West. His critics, now dwindling, accused him of building an army that served the man, not the Republic. But for the average citizen, safe, fed, and proud, Washington's power was a comfort, not a threat. They did not see tyranny, they saw stability. The laurel wreath upon his head was not a crown of conquest, it was the halo of salvation. By 1799, the Archon's age had caught up to him. The years of war and rule had worn him down. As sickness took hold, the nation's breath froze. Bells rang across every city and village as word spread that George Washington, savior of the Republic, had died. His funeral in New York drew thousands. Veterans wept, mothers carried infants who would never know a world without him. But Washington's creation did not die with him. His system, centralized, disciplined, self-sustaining, was too strong to collapse. Into the vacuum stepped his most brilliant disciple, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's election as the second Archon of the United States in late 1799 was more coronation than contest. James Madison, his last serious rival, could only watch as the Federalist machine swept the nation. Hamilton's rise marked a turning point. Where Washington had been a soldier statesman, Hamilton was a visionary and an uncompromising one. He believed in hierarchy, merit, and order. To Hamilton, the Republic was not a playground for mass democracy, but a finely tuned instrument that required the guidance of the educated elite. He tightened property requirements for voting, ensuring that only men of substance, the natural guardians of liberty, as he called them, could shape the nation's destiny. The poor, immigrants, and people of color remained outside the political sphere.
Hamilton argued that stability demanded it.
His suspicion of outsiders ran deep.
The French Revolution had convinced him that uncontrolled immigration bred disorder. In a series of decrees, he restricted entry to Protestants from Britain and Northern Europe, barring Catholic immigrants from Ireland, France, and southern Germany.
America must preserve the blood that birthed her freedom, he declared.
Critics accused him of bigotry, but Hamilton saw it as prudence.
A homogeneous citizenry, he believed, was the foundation of peace.
Hamilton's foreign policy mirrored his domestic one, cold, precise, and mercilessly pragmatic.
He saw Britain not as the old enemy, but as the model to emulate.
Its navy, its empire, its commerce, all were proof of the power he sought to replicate.
When war once again engulfed Europe, Hamilton aligned decisively with London. In 1800, the Archon declared war on revolutionary France and its allies, joining Britain in the Second Coalition. Congress balked at the idea of sending troops to Europe, so Hamilton turned his eyes south, to Spain, France's faltering partner. The conquest was swift. General Andrew Jackson, a young officer whose fiery temper matched his courage, led American troops into Louisiana, seizing New Orleans and choking off Spain's lifeline to the Mississippi. Another force swept through Florida, capturing it with barely a skirmish.
The U.S. Navy dominated the Caribbean, smashing Spanish fleets and seizing Cuba after a lightning naval campaign. By 1802, the war was over. Spain's humiliation was complete. In the Treaty of Havana, Louisiana, Florida, and Cuba passed into American hands. The Archon's empire now stretched from the Atlantic to the Rio Grande, from Canada's forests to the Caribbean's tropical harbors. Peace brought prosperity. Hamilton's American system fused Washington's military discipline with economic mastery. Tariffs filled the treasury. The first bank of the United States, now the beating heart of the economy, financed canals, railroads, and factories. Trade with war-torn Europe exploded. Hamilton's reforms turned America into a humming engine of progress. State debts were erased, local militias dismantled, and all authority flowed from the federal center. The old independence of the states, once sacred, vanished into administrative uniformity. The republic had become a single organism, efficient and unyielding. But the prosperity masked a moral reckoning. The Southern economy, built on slavery, clashed with Hamilton's industrial vision. In 1820, the Missouri crisis erupted. Refusing to compromise, Hamilton forced Missouri to enter as a free state, citing both morality and modernization. No nation, he warned, can march into the future with chains upon its ankles. The South revolted. Plantations burned, militias rose, and banners of rebellion flew over South Carolina.
Hamilton responded like a general, not a politician.
The Archon's army swept through the South, crushing the uprising within months. Slaveholders were compensated through federal tariffs, a cold, transactional end to centuries of bondage. Nearly 1.5 million people were freed overnight in a nation of barely 8 million. What followed was chaos. Hamilton, unwilling to grant citizenship to the freed population, orchestrated a sweeping plan of relocation to Mexico, bribing local governors to accept them. It was a brutal and controversial act, condemned by abolitionists as moral cowardice and by planters as tyranny. Yet Hamilton called it a necessary correction in the course of civilization. Still, the economic boom that followed silenced most critics. The South industrialized, the ports thrived, and Hamilton's America marched toward modernity. Under his rule, political parties remained banned.
Elections were ceremonial. The Archon's council, led by John Quincy Adams, functioned as an echo chamber of the Archon's will.
The judiciary rubber-stamped his decrees, and Congress existed merely to formalize them.
Without the distraction of partisan strife, Hamilton claimed, America could focus on greatness.
He was not wrong. By 1825, the United States was an industrial titan, its navy unrivaled, its wealth unmatched. Hamilton's alliance with Britain made it the dominant power of the Western Hemisphere. When he died in 1827, the Archon was buried beside Washington beneath a marble monument inscribed with the words, "Order, Liberty, Eternity."
Under Washington and Hamilton, the American Republic had become something new, a disciplined empire wrapped in the language of liberty.
It was a nation that worshipped virtue, wealth, and order, a Rome reborn in the New World.
It had abolished slavery, conquered half a continent, and replaced freedom's chaos with the machinery of progress.
But at what cost? The dream of equality had faded into hierarchy.
The Republic's soul, once ablaze with revolutionary spirit, now burned with imperial ambition.
Had America followed this path, crowned with laurel rather than liberty, the world might have witnessed a century ruled not by the ideals of democracy, but by the cold perfection of power.